And with that, let's talk about our next panel. Let's go into our wonderful panel about marketing your stories through podcasts. Part of when I put out my new book was I wanted to take a look at all of these various marketing methods so I could try to teach the guild about them myself. And of course, selfishly, we all want to try to remember, like, I want to sell my book. And I hope that if you're writing a book out there, you can absolutely write things for fun, and that is wonderful. And you can absolutely just submit to anthologies, and I highly encourage it. I love submitting to anthologies. However, what if you got this book? How do we market it? You've made all your furry tweets. Maybe you've got it on the dealer's den at a convention. Check out the dealer's den. Um, or you've got your local author's corner, or maybe you've even been brave and when regular things start again, you hit up the artist's alley and you make that attempt to do written commissions and you have these books on the side. How do we tackle this? One of the great ways, especially during this time of COVID, is to market through podcasts. I would ask for a raise of hands, but we're not a live panel. But I bet quite a few of you have been listening to more podcasts during this pandemic. A lot of us have needed that kind of entertainment and creativity right now, and essentially artistry. It's just like how I know I've been reading more books, even more than usual. Um, this is something that is a thing now, and podcasts are more powerful than ever to market your book. There are websites that aggregate lists of here's the top 10 podcasts for LGBT books. You look at those lists, find the author people's contact information, and send them your pitch, send them your email. I will say it again from the beginning. If you're a furry, A plus, it's probably going to get you booked. At first, I thought it would almost be impossible for me to actually get on a podcast. I thought this was going to be a failed experiment. And by the time I was done, I have now appeared on 8 podcasts with the possibility of a couple more in the near future. And only a few of them were furry based and focused, which is wild. Which even going back to the previous panel, there are subreddits and things like that for marketing your specific books in your genres or anything else. When you go to look up things like, okay, I wrote a fantasy novel, you can check out these places and find out here's a fantasy novel podcast. Let's look this up and send them your pitch. It is a wonderful idea, and you more than likely not only get to talk about the book, you get to talk a little bit about yourself. You get to talk a little bit about the writing to get people interested. And one of the best parts about podcasts is that it's a permanent link to your book. If you search my book, What Makes a Witch, on Google, you're not only going to find my book for sale, find my reviews on various places online, you're going to find me on these podcasts linked to where you can buy my book forever. It is a wonderful, wonderful way to help advertise your book and give it some staying power. And that SEO thing that everyone hears about is very, very helpful for that. um, Another wonderful thing with podcasts, again, the hunting for them is going to be a little more difficult and expect, of course, some denials. It's the same thing as applying to anything else or even pitching your novel. Not everyone's going to want to talk about it. But don't be afraid to also talk about your novel on a podcast that isn't purely about writing. A lot of writing podcasts, or podcasts that look at stuff about books, are heavily looked at by publishers and authors more than a mainstream audience. This is worth noting. Podcasts are absolutely marvelous for advertising yourself, but you're probably putting yourself in front of the librarians, the book readers, which can be very useful, but is limited in its scope. So, how do we keep pushing things further? My book, What Makes a Witch, I started reaching out to witchcraft podcasts, which happened after one just happened to find me and said, wait a minute, we're a queer witchcraft podcast, and you wrote a book about queer witchcraft in any way whatsoever. We're in. Can we talk to you about your book? And when you pitch it to these audiences in particular, where it's your niche, again, maybe you're talking about sci-fi, or maybe you have a medical drama furry novel, which sounds fascinating. Someone should write that, and if you don't, I will. But Maybe you can talk to a podcast that could go over these interesting things. Maybe in terms of the medical thing like that. I bet you there's podcasts out there for veterinarians, and you could talk to them about here's how this study worked and how we had to figure out how this would work for anthropomorphic animals and use this as a discussion point. When you're pitching this to podcasts that aren't strictly overwriting, the best way to approach it is you are not only making content for yourself, because yes, we're being selfish and we want to advertise our books, and no podcaster is going to be dumb and think that that's not the main goal. You are also providing the podcasters with interesting and unique content. When you're trying to pitch these things, you can tell them, I am the furry, I wrote this book. This is definitely unique. Here are some of the talking points that we could talk about. Those things are absolutely wonderful because some podcasts are going to have very strict flows, and here's the questions that we ask every time, and this is the order we go in. But if you can come to them and go, this is what I could like bring to the table, this is the specific thing that I am going for, you're far more likely to not get a rejection. Before I continue on, also, again, if anyone has any random questions, please let me know. We'll move off into side 10. I'm very happy to answer questions. So I wanted to go into this with marketing. We've talked about the how, and we've talked about why this can be wonderful. What happens when you get onto the podcast itself? This is a very good question. But yes, great question. So you have to think about it from the angle of contributing to the show and how you'll integrate into their format. Absolutely. Because there are wonderful furry podcasts out there. I did an interview with Furcast about my book and furry writing in general, and I would highly recommend if any of you are interested in definitely appearing on a show, talk to Furcast. They were phenomenal to work with. We have so many furry podcasts, not just for writing, but everything else. Those ones are going to be pretty easy sells. Hi, I wrote a furry book. Do you guys want to talk? When you're going to the other shows, you need to think about how is this going to work with them. I mean, for me, it was very easy. For some of them, this certain podcast wanted to interview queer authors, and I'm like, great, I'm part of this wonderful, this wonderful fandom that has a lot of LGBT plus people, and it's absolutely wonderful. And oh my gosh, this is such a good comment from Merciful Kate. As a podcaster who gets approached a lot, please listen to an episode first and make sure your content and suggestion is a fit. My podcast is nonfiction and never has guests, but people approach me all the time asking to guest. Yes, this is wonderful, and oh my gosh, I could have accidentally missed mentioning this, so thank you so much for that comment. Look, people who podcast or do everything else, they have their groups they chat in too. I bet you there is a podcast furries group on Telegram, and if there's not, someone's going to create it immediately after this panel. If you are annoying various groups and not paying attention to their submission guidelines, or submitting to every blog that exists, or doing that kind of a thing, people are going to know your name, and it's eventually going to become one that is associated with being annoying. You don't want to do that. Find these lists of podcasts, do these cool things, listen to them, and then make sure they're the right fit before you send it in. Because if a podcast absolutely never wants guests, and that is their big thing, and they're like, nope, I'm not interested, then you're not going to be a guest. Or if they're like, yes, we talk about writing, but book reviews are an absolute no-no. If you go to them and ask for a book review, you're just going to make them annoyed, and maybe they know that one publisher person that you ended up eventually submitting to, or maybe they are the publisher person that you eventually end up submitting to. You don't want to have a bad working relationship with anybody as much as you can avoid it. From here, I do want to talk about what to expect when you're on podcasts. First thing is expect the unexpected. It's terrible, terrible advice, but and it's very cheesy, but every podcast is going to be different. Not everything is going to be the same. However, there's probably a few basic things that you can look out for and expect. First, you're probably going to have to talk on your podcast. I know this is silly to say, but it's something that people don't think about. If you are very worried about public speaking, there are probably actually podcasts that are better for you to work with, or podcasts that are heavily edited, or the editor is willing to work with you if you're having your nerves, or they're going to be highly encouraging. I worked with the Rote podcast for one of the podcasts, and I absolutely have to shout them out. because the amount of comfort and just even random side tangents we went on to talk about certain topics, just because we were interested, made me feel incredibly comfortable and made the conversation better. Listen to podcasts like was previously suggested, and you're going to find some really, really good information out there to see if you're going to be able to be comfortable. If you don't think you can comfortably do the speaking thing, it sucks, but podcasts are probably not your choice. It sucks that you're going to lose out on that particular marketing angle, but it's better for you to not overly stress yourself too. The world is a hard enough place as it is, and writing is challenging. You don't want to make your day terrible by trying to go record a podcast and then feeling awful afterwards. Who does? Nobody. The next big thing then you have to think about is audio. Most podcasters are pretty good these days at, if you're going to be on a voice call, being able to edit your audio to be pretty decent, even if it's not great. I'm going to suggest to you immediately that you should not be using your headphones you bought at Walmart for $9 that have the microphone attached as your microphone. That might be a little terrible. But you also don't have to go out and buy an 100 something dollar mic either. The majority of my podcast recordings were done on my phone. I actually have a very nice microphone that is in the 50-ish dollar range. But we actually did the recordings through my phone, and it worked really, really well. A lot of people's phones these days, especially if you have a nice smartphone, are probably strong enough to actually do that. And then whatever app they have you install that is a part of recording, congratulations, you just pop it on the phone now and you are good to go without any other technical issues. Now, if you want to do more, there are mixing programs out there specifically for microphones. You can get everything set up so that even if you're, let's say, doing a Skype call, you can have your microphone set up to perfect levels, break out that background noise, do the whole thing. You can set yourself up with a booth. There are some really fun tutorials online on how to make essentially a cardboard box sound booth that you basically just stick your head in and you get high quality sound. You can do this on the cheap, but it is not necessary. Just it is something to consider when you are going to be on the podcast. How am I going to be speaking with people on the podcast? Part of this also comes in, what app will I be speaking through? The panels that we had to do here today, we had to make a switch somewhat last minute for Discord because we had streaming issues involving audio. And this is one of those things that is worth considering in general. Sometimes you're going to be like, I don't really use Skype anymore. Is Skype still a thing? Can we try insert this other program that you say you can record through? But try to pick essentially the best program and be flexible. A lot of podcasts still record through Skype. Skype has had tools built in for it for podcast recording for years now, and with a lot more moves to things like Discord or other larger groups, it is incredibly popular. So be prepared to have a Skype account potentially and to have to actually share that ad around, like be able to add people, know how it works. If they say they want you to use some other specific program, take a little bit of time before it starts so you understand the basic approach and how it goes. Um, again, be prepared for the unexpected because randomly a server could crash in the middle of your podcast recording, and you may have to not only just record an entire podcast over again, but may have to suddenly switch program. Be ready for it. I had to do this with one of my podcasts. The original program we intended to use just stopped working. They went under unannounced server maintenance in the middle of podcast recording. So we had to just improvise entirely, and it was wild, but it worked out pretty well. So it's not something to be horrified over, and it's not the worst thing ever. But it's something you need to absolutely be prepared for, and you can read podcasts that are like open specifically for submissions from you too. You can read how they do this. They usually tell you what programs to use and they use and all of that, so you can be prepared. And also, as part in general of the voice thing, some podcasts are going to ask you to read a section of your book. I mean, it's going to be very tempting to just read the first chapter, and there's a good chance that your first chapter is the choice. But just in general, make sure that you have a section that is going to be good. Make sure that you have your blurb prepared for the book so you don't have to hunt and go, oh crap, that's right, I gotta pull out that blurb. Crap, what are the wording on that again? You don't want to have to do that. It's going to throw off your game. Have those basic things prepared and ready to go, which moves right into the next chunk of something to expect in general. from a podcast, not all podcasts are going to give you notes. Some podcasts are going to be wonderful. I mentioned the Rote podcast, and I mentioned that I talked to a queer witching podcast called Witches Betwixt. I absolutely need to shout them out because the working experience with recording with them was marvelous. And what they did specifically was they sent me notes on here are the main topics we are going to talk about so that you can think a little bit on your answers. Because let's be honest, getting a very deep question on the fly can be very difficult. We're talking about things for a queer podcast. One of the main things I was asked was, what kinds, like we're all in a pandemic, what kinds of media have you been consuming that have inspired your stories? And it might be really obvious that I've been binging shows on Netflix while I'm writing, but if you had just popped me that question on the fly, probably couldn't have started naming names very easily, because which ones really have been influencing my writing? So if you are really, really ready to go, it is a very wonderful thing to have those notes and don't ignore them. Don't think I am an improvisation king, queen, or non binary monarch and I can tackle this. Take them to heart and use them to really craft a story. I'm seeing Fuzzwolf is mentioning to have your elevator pitch in mind, and this is exactly that. This is essentially not just having that elevator pitch to pitch your book, because that's very helpful to get people to listen to it on the podcast, but you can build off that pitch with your answers and be able to bring things back into discussing not only you as an author to get people interested, but to get people interested in the kind of story you wrote. It's very, very helpful, and it's going to be something, again, I highly recommend. If you're lucky, have those notes, use them. If the podcaster does not provide you notes, then what? Well, it may be time to pull off that improvisation that we were talking about, which can be very difficult. But as someone who, even before phone calls, admittedly sometimes likes to script out and have my bullet points, which I literally have for this presentation, um, having your ideas on what you want to talk about in front of your face is very helpful. At times, you could be like, oh, yeah, that's right. I was going to mention this specific cool little hook. And it comes up in conversation, that one wonderful little segue. You could be like, oh, and that reminds me of this thing that's going on in this part of the book, or this is the sequel thing that I was talking about. It's really, really wonderful in that way to have those notes in front of you. And I mean, different podcasters will also react to this differently, but you can also potentially pitch to them, hey, these are topics that I know I specifically want to talk about. Is that okay? And especially for interviews, this is a really wonderful thing. I've had a couple people just do this for the Furry Writers Guild when we do interviews. They've had things where they sat down and they said, okay, we want to do this specific thing. Like, I know that for sure I need to talk about this part of the book or this specific topic. Is that okay with you? Can we talk about these things? And that is wonderful because it gives them a place to go too. As we mentioned earlier, part of what you're doing is pitching the content for them and what makes it interesting. So helping them bring that to life is only going to help you in a positive manner. It certainly cannot hurt you. Um, those are my main talking points. If anyone has any general questions, I am very always happy to take side tangents and discuss those. In general, other than that, um, oh gosh, okay, very solid topic. Some podcasts are also going to actually set up things for you in terms of marketing, this isn't as common from all of my experiences, but some will literally have, here's some marketing images for you. This is when these tweets come out. This is when this will be on Facebook. This is the whole thing. They will tell you all of this stuff or how to set up a listening party and do all of that. If you can, follow them to a T. It may end up being your listening party may only end up with you and not have a lot of people. I mean, that's kind of what happened to me, unfortunately, because the listening party thing they usually do is set up through Facebook, and I don't have a big Facebook presence. But if you try these things, it's not only going to maybe potentially find you something awesome, but the podcasters are going to appreciate it. If the podcasters are putting out tweets about your podcast, don't you dare forget to retweet and talk about how wonderful a time you had. Don't you dare do that because it's going to get you uninvited from your next chance to talk to somebody. And not only that, but they put in all that hard work. And yes, you gave them content, but They let you talk about your book. So make sure that you are doing the same thing in return. And don't be afraid on social media to bump that podcast and be like, "Hey guys, do you remember that they talked to them about this podcast? Like I talked to them about my book, or I talked to them about my writing, or I talked to them about insert whatever it is that you got to talk to them about here." Pop it on your Twitter multiple times. Pop it on your social media multiple times because not everyone is online at every hour of the day. And at least for me on Twitter, I don't have Twitter notifications on for every single person I'm following because that would make my brain explode. Um, and yes, a wonderful comment by Kizek. Professionalism is key. Now, when I say professionalism, I mean, again, we're furries here and we're a little weird. Don't be afraid to be your furry self. Let your freak flag fly a little bit. If anyone follows myself on Twitter, I'm going to plug myself because I mean, I want to follow. I'm Literal Grill on Twitter. People can probably see that sometimes I'm a bit of a goofball, and right now I've been making tons of clown jokes. And don't be afraid to have fun, especially on the podcast, is probably good advice because you'd be amazed at what people end up engaging with your content on. I've been making goofy clown posts because I wanted to make a dumb joke, and then those have been some of the most engaged tweets that I have gotten in forever. So if you want to, I mean, obviously be a professional. Don't say words you shouldn't be saying. Don't go in there and start talking about the smut you write on the middle grade fiction podcast. Um, it's probably not a great idea uh, for obvious reasons, but make sure that you're promoting the things that they ask you to promote, especially if they're asking politely. Make sure that you come on time, if not early, to the podcast for recording. I mean, there's always going to be technical issues, but make sure you're ready to jump on that and you're flexible. But also, definitely have some fun. I cannot tell you how much fun I had on the majority of the podcasts that I was on. Um, it's I mean, and I know I am more comfortable with public speaking. So again, take my advice from earlier that if you're not big on public speech, this might not be for you. But if you are definitely big on that kind of thing, or you like to joke around and you want your comedic side to be shown to the people listening, go for it. Be brave, because at worst, most podcasters unsurprisingly have editors. And if there's really a moment that just falls flat, or just, that didn't really work, you can probably politely ask, hey, this part isn't so great. Could we edit that out? And some podcasters will even offer you the opportunity to do a pre listen and then do the editing. Like, oh gosh, I can't believe that I said this. Like, or like, oops, I didn't mean to go off on that tangent about that one editor this one time. I don't want to hurt their feelings. That's not great. Can you help me with this and make sure that I don't do this because we all make mistakes? Which is probably another wonderful part of the professionalism advice in general to make sure that when you're talking about things on podcasts, don't badmouth people, don't be rude to people. Um, it's not a good idea. I know some people, quote unquote, make a brand on being brutally honest, but I promise you that's probably not going to win you anything. But in general, this wraps up my general discussion on using podcasts to market your work in this wonderful conjunction on the previous panel on how to market your work to mainstream audiences. I really, really do hope that the combination of the two is really, really helpful. If I don't see any other questions in the next like couple seconds here, we are going to take a short break. We had to have a slight paneling and schedule switch, and I just need a little time for some water and everything else. And hopefully, when we come back, we'll be talking about furry poetry. So I really hope to see you all around for that.